Good morning. I'm Harley Schlanger from the LaRouche Organization with your daily video update for May 31st, 2023. I'm going to be starting today with a discussion of the drone attack on Moscow, which was reported yesterday morning. 8 drones hit Moscow. The Russians described this as a terror attack. There was minimal damage as the drones were mostly intercepted. But the fact is that this represents an obvious escalation coming from Ukraine targeting Russia, although the Ukrainian government, of course, said they had nothing to do with it. This occurred several weeks after the May 3rd attack, where 2 drones were shot at the Kremlin. They were also intercepted. But this was viewed by many in Russia as, in security agencies, as an assassination attempt against President Putin. Now, in some ways, this can be seen as a sign of desperation coming from a Ukrainian government, which has been hyping the idea of a spring offensive, hyping it for the purposes of getting more weapons, air fighter jets, more tanks, more ammunition, more money. And it does appear as though in the absence of the possibility of success of such an offensive, that they're escalating in a different way, and it's what you might call irregular warfare. Now, the assassination threat is real. This was stated by several Ukrainian officials. The deputy of the GUR, which is their internal intelligence division, Skibitsky, announced that Putin is on the hit list. Now, further, there are comments from Anton Gedashenko, who has been associated with Mirotverets, the other hit list that's put out by the Ukrainian Interior Ministry. Gedashenko is today an official advisor to President Zelensky. He was formerly Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs. And he gave an interview to the Kiev Post on May 24th, in which he made some fairly interesting remarks. He said that the death of Putin would be the, quote, best scenario for the fastest end of Russia's invasion, unquote. And he cited something called the Ukrainian Institute for the Future, which said that if Putin dies, there's a 90% probability that the successor would be forced to stop military actions in Ukraine and would negotiate compensation and return all territory. I wonder where this fantasy comes from. But Gedashenko said there's only one person who would continue the war if Putin is dead, and that's Prigozhin, the head of the Wagner brigades. And he said, as a result of this assessment, the armed forces of Ukraine are trying to liquidate him. So the idea of assassination as a major weapon in the hands of Ukraine was stated by leading officials of the government. Now, meanwhile, on the question of the counteroffensive, and by the way, Gedashenko also said the attacks into Russia are justified. And he said that attacks by Ukrainian forces into Russia are justified. So the question is, what's happening with the counteroffensive? Well, the G7 made pledges. NATO continues to promise more weapons, tanks, F-16s, artillery, and cash to pay government expenses for the purpose of keeping the war going, to tie up Russia, to isolate Russia, and to weaken Russia. Now, among the experts commenting on this was Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who said Ukraine lacks the manpower to do an effective counteroffensive, especially skilled manpower, trained pilots, maintenance, and so on. And he said that in order to win, they're going to rely on the will of the Ukrainian forces. And Zelensky keeps saying, we're going to fight to the end. Now, RUSI, the Royal United Services Institute, put out a paper that's kind of interesting. It comments on the Russian military, quote, meat grinder, unquote, tactic that says that Russia has made some changes in its strategic and tactical military policy. And they had to do this because of the lack of success on their initial strategy. But the article ends by saying that the improvements for Ukraine in the air combat environment are necessary for Ukrainian victory. In other words, they must get the F-16s and other kinds of capabilities. Now remember, Russia previously called for long-range missiles capable of targeting Crimea, what they called the Crimea Missile Crisis. So the drumbeat from Britain continues for an escalation, as well as from the United States, from the Biden administration and its coordinators such as Blinken and Sullivan. Now, meanwhile, there's tensions developing in Kosovo. Violence erupted in Kosovo when Serbians were protesting the treatment of Serbs in northern Kosovo. The KFOR forces, that is the Kosovo forces of NATO, were called in. There were 30 of them wounded yesterday, and NATO said they will send in more troops. Now, the question then also comes up, how long will Europe tolerate this? Because the economic costs to Europe have been quite extensive, and increasingly European nations such as Germany are becoming a player in the NATO versus Russia war. And this raises the question of would there be possible Russian strikes on other countries, including NATO countries. Now, there's an interesting article by Patrick Lawrence in the Consortium News titled Europe's Fate. And he describes the tectonic shift that's occurring in world affairs, centered on the role of China, especially on this question of the rejection by the global South of the demands for sanctions against Russia, the move toward trade and investment in national currencies away from the dollar, the so-called de-dollarization. And he says Western leaders seem to be blind to these changes. They were caught off guard, for example, by China's role in the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. And they seem to be somewhat frozen by the move toward de-dollarization. So he asks, why are European leaders so stuck? And he said, well, Macron made the comment that Europe must not be vassals. But Lawrence quotes Varoufakis, the former Greek finance minister, saying that they're worse than vassals. Now, this is a part of the paradox of the European Union, the so-called integration policy, because it appears as though integration means states must give up their sovereignty and submit to one set of rules with the U.S. as the hegemon in a rules-based order, as opposed to having strategic autonomy. Now, Lawrence writes, quote, Europe's capitalist oligarchs have too great an interest in U.S. hegemony for the structure of power to change, unquote. Well, this is a problem for Europe. It's also a problem for U.S. policymakers. And I'll be discussing this today in the weekly dialogue with Helga Zepp-LaRouche, which you can join. It will be live at 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time. You can get it at theschillerinstitute.com. And you can send your questions to questions@schillerinstitute.org. So you can join us today at 11 a.m. to discuss this and to hear what Helga Zepp-LaRouche has to say upon her return from an eventful week in China. Now, finally, let me just note that tomorrow I will address the case of Henry Kissinger at 100 years old, still evil after all these years. So join me today with Helga Zepp-LaRouche and for the update tomorrow. The link to the dialogue with Helga will be posted at the bottom of the description section. Hello, thanks for watching. Be sure to like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss any of our videos. Support our independence to produce videos like these. Become a member of the LaRouche organization at thelarouche.org/member. By becoming a member for $25 or more, you'll get special access to the EIR Alert Daily Briefing and Weekly Magazine, which is what I read to stay on top of things.